Hi, I'm Larry Puckett, the DCC guy. Well, as you can see, I've made some progress here in the last week. So what I want to do today is take you back in time and show you how I added the feeders to the track, added the various riser blocks that needed to be installed, did the splice job here to add this piece of roadbed that will start us up into the second level of the Helix, and get that finally glued and screwed in place. So, a lot to cover today. Let's get started. Hit that little red subscribe button, and when the little bell comes up, click on it and click all. Thanks now. Now, one thing I recommend before you go any further, after you've installed your first section of first loop of track and are ready to install the roadbed over top of it, check it, give it a test run, make sure that there are no problems that you have to fix before you go any further. And the easiest thing to do to test that is to just run a couple of locomotives over the track and watch how they run. See if there's any problems. And the main thing that you want to look out for is right here at each one of the rail joiners. Look out to see if there's any irregularities in the locomotives as they pass over those rail joiners, because there are a couple of things that can happen. First of all, since you're working with the plastic here, the plastic ties, that can soften when you are applying heat to solder your rail joiners together. And under the right conditions, if you're overdoing it, then these rails can actually move closer to one another, and it can be a tight spot right here. And you can watch as your locomotives pass through here. Do they slow down? Do they jump a little bit as they're trying to go through that tight spot? The other thing that can happen is when you're installing the rail joiners, if you do not undercut the area where the joiner itself goes underneath of the rail, then it will actually lift the rail up the thickness of the rail joiner itself. And what that will do is it will create a little hump or a little bump right here. And a diesel locomotive isn't that sensitive to it because the trucks swivel independently, so it'll just kind of move over that. But when a steam locomotive comes along with its 6 or 8 drivers all tight coupled in a row, it will go over that hump, and you will notice that the cab will tip up when the locomotive has completely gone over that hump. And that's because it's like a little teeter-totter there. So the locomotive goes up, over, and then drops, the front of the engine drops down, and the cab roof will pop up. And that's a good sign that you have a hump somewhere in the track, and specifically at these rail joiners. Let's run a diesel locomotive up here first, and we'll watch it. Okay, it passed through that rail joiner without any problems at all. It's approaching a second one there. No problems there. And we'll go on up. No problems at that spot. And let's see, we'll get the next one. No problems there. Okay, I'm just going to step in and lift it off the track. And now let's go ahead and run one of my big J-Class 484 locomotives up, because if something's going to tip, this would do it. Okay, we're coming up on the first joiner here. Okay, no problems there. It did not tip at all. It did not have any problem going through the joiner itself. Okay, here's the next one. Okay, that's gone through there smooth. No problems back there. And we're coming up on the final one. Okay, right there. Okay, no problems at all. This locomotive is making it up the hill without any trouble. It should. It's got traction tires on the rear wheels for the rear drivers. What do you do, though, if you find that you've got a bad spot here, a high spot? Well, one thing you can do is heat the individual rails at the rail joiner enough to just soften the ties themselves. And then when the ties are softened a little bit, just press down with something like a pair of pliers or screwdriver, anything, and press it down and hold it as those ties cool. And that in turn will push the hump back down. And because you've heated the rails enough to soften the ties and also melt the solder, when the joint cools again, it will be flat and straight. So that's a quick and easy way to fix that. Now, if you find that your rails are too close together, you can also do a similar thing there where you just heat the rails and push the ties apart just a little bit and then let them soften again. But do not heat these to the point that the ties start to melt and totally distort. So you might want to practice doing this on some spare pieces of track before you actually do it on the layout. Because if you start messing up, it can be a real problem to fix after that. Another thing that I want to point out, before I started laying all of the rails in their final positions, I went over all of these gaps right here, or joints, where I joined these roadbed sections together with an orbital sander. And I sanded them down nice and smooth so that I made sure there weren't going to be any bumps or irregularities at these joints here where I spliced the roadbed together. And so that gave me a good smooth roadbed, a good rise, and I think we're going to see that we're going to get pretty good pulling power out of my locomotives here. So one of the things that I want to test before I go any further is the pulling power. How many cars can a typical locomotive pull up this Helix? So I'm going to use my Southern RS11 here. It's an older Atlas RS unit that I've custom painted and decorated. And it weighs in at about 11.3 ounces. So it's not going to be as good a puller as, say, one of my F3s or F7s or something like that come in at about 16 ounces, or some of the others, that bigger locomotives that might be able to pull more. But this will be a good example of what a typical locomotive can pull up the Helix. So I've got 10 cars plus a caboose. The cars are all weighted to NMRA standards. So we're going to start the locomotive and the train here. It's on a grade already, so we're going to see whether or not it can start a train with 11 cars going up a grade and then proceed all the way to the top here. So let me kick this on here. Okay, it's not having any trouble starting the train. That's a good sign right there. And we're going to move it on up the hill. I'm increasing the throttle a bit, that's why it's ramping up. Okay, it's starting to slip going up the hill a bit there. Once it got fully engaged going up the hill, it started having a problem. So let me back it back down, and we're going to cut it down to 10 cars. Okay, I pulled one of the pulp racks out. Okay, let's see how it does with 10 cars. Okay, so it looks like 10 cars is going to be the magic number for a single locomotive. Now, with a F unit that weighs a bit more, it's going to have more tractive effort and capability, so it can probably pull 11 or 12. So what I know then is that my typical locomotive can pull about 10 cars up the grade by itself. Now, since I typically run 2 powered locomotives on each train, I theoretically should be able to pull 20 cars up the hill without any problem at all, which is actually more than I had planned on. I had expected to have trains of about 15 cars going up the Helix from the staging yard. Then we'll back it back down here. And I don't know if you can hear the difference, but the sound of the locomotive makes more noise than the rolling cars do. Well, now that we've checked out how the locomotives and trains are going to operate on the track, and I'm satisfied with the job that I've done so far with the soldering of the rail joiners, it's time to move on and start adding the feeders for this particular section of the Helix itself. Now, one thing to remember about wiring for DCC. With Code 83 track, I recommend putting feeders to your track about every 6 to 8 feet. And since it's almost 16 feet all the way around on each loop, I'm going to be using 2 feeders for every loop. So I need an inner and an outer rail feeder on this side, and I'll need an inner and an outer rail feeder on this side. And that is for each loop of the track. And what I'm going to be using is 20 gauge solid wire, and I'm going to be attaching it right here to the sides of the rail joiners. And they've essentially been pre-tinned with solder on their sides, so I can solder directly to these. I've already stripped back, about a ½ inch of the insulation from the wire. So I've already pre-bent it to the dogleg shape that I use to attach my feeders to the sides of the rails. Make sure we get it straight there. And then I'm going to just apply a little bit of solder up front so that it will be an instantaneous joint as soon as I apply the heat to this connection. So let's get these done. What I'm going to do is attach it right here. And let that solder cool. And then I'm going to give it a good tug test to make sure it's good and solid. And it is. And just to make sure that I don't have any solder on the top of the rail, I'm just going to run over it with a little file. And that's going to give me a good smooth surface there. Okay, now I want this down in here out of the way. So I'm going to press it down just between the ties, like so. And it's now out of the way. And I'm going to feed it over here to the side, and I'll bring it on down and back along the cross member that supports this section of track. Okay, so now for the red one on the outside rail, I've done the same thing. I've made my little dogleg bend here and curved it back so that it's going to fit against the side of the rail joiner. So what I want to do here is I'm going to slide it underneath of the rail joiners so it fits underneath of the track and it's out of the way, and bring it in here. And then I'm going to pre-tin it as well. Like that. And then I'm going to pull this in good and tight against the side of the rail joiner there. So that's ready for connection. There we go. And get my soldering iron back over here. And we'll touch that and get a quick connection there. Okay, that should do it. Yep. It's holding very good and tight. Now, again, just go over it lightly with a small file to make sure that there's no solder that got on the surface. So we've got a good clean joint there on both sides. And as on the first one, I'm just going to bring this over here and tuck it out of the way. And I'm going to go ahead and do this to the other side, and no need to show you that on camera because I want to go ahead and proceed with adding the first piece of the second level of roadbed right over this section of track here. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to want to do is start moving up in the world. And that involves adding this next level here. So what we're going to have is this piece added on here with a splice, and it's going to rest on these riser blocks. And I've shown you this before. These are the blocks that I've cut. They're exactly 3 inches tall, each one of them. I set up a jig and just cut out a whole box full of these on my chop saw so that I could have them ready for when we needed to start adding the next sections of the roadbed. So the first thing we're going to need to do is install these various risers here along this section of the first level. And then once those are glued down and nailed down, and I'm going to use my pneumatic brad nailer for that, then we'll be able to add this next level on top of it. So the first thing I want to do is put it in place like this. And I'm going to use one of these clamps like this to hold it there firmly. And then I want to come over right here. And the first thing we need to do here is make sure that the center line of the track radius that I drew on here is directly over the center line here on the lower section. And it's important to get this lined up correctly, because if you don't, then you're going to start to wander and it's going to skew off one side or the other. And you don't want that. You want them lined up perfectly so that the weight is going to be distributed through these risers back down to the firm foundation we built with the base. So how do you test that? Well, Jeff Johnson had a great way of doing this, and that's what I'm going to show you. You take your square like this and put it right on the end of the section of roadbed. And once you get this edge of your square lined up with the center line on the upper piece, and then sight right down and make sure that you're directly over the center of the line below it. And that way you know it's going to be the same. As long as you do that every place where you make these types of connections. So that looks like it's perfectly lined up, no problems at all. So I want to fix this in place at that point. And we'll check this again before we make the final installation. So once I get everything lined up, I'm going to take my quick grip clamp and set it right here on the edge and clamp down on that so nothing's going to move. And then I want to take and mark the location for where these blocks are going to be placed. Just like that. And I'm going to do that at a couple of other positions further back. And then I'll show you how we're going to permanently set all these in place. So we've got the positions for the blocks, the riser blocks, marked off. And what I want to do is take my Titebond 3 glue first and give us a nice liberal coating here on the bottom with our Titebond and set that in place right there on the edge like that, and do another one here like so and set it in place. Okay, and I'll do the same with all of these, but I'm not going to repeat it and show you that. Now that I've got that in place, I'm going to lock it down using my quick grip clamp. It's kind of hard to get a grip right there, but we'll do that. And I'll get one on the other side as well. As I said, I've got this pneumatic brad nailer with 2-inch brads in it, and I'm just going to shoot a brad down each side to stabilize it while it dries. Okay, there's one. And number 2. And I think I can take that off now. That's going to hold it permanently while it's drying. And we'll go over here and do this one. So, and like that. And those are going to hold very, very tight. Okay, so we've got that setting up. And I'm going to go ahead and do that with the other pairs of these further back that I have marked off. Okay, I have 3 pairs of blocks here. This is the first one I showed you. And I've got one set here and another one back here. And some of you have probably noticed that there's a little bit of a gap right in here, but I can't put one right here because the track is located here. And it's just not going to work out because of the curvature. So I'm going to have to go with that much of a gap across it. I'm not concerned. This 1/2-inch plywood is very rigid, very strong stuff. So I'm not concerned that it's going to sag over time. Okay, so the next step is installing the next level. And what we're going to do for that is a simple glue and screw job. But the first thing I have to do back here is get this splice plate done. So let me move in here and show you that one, and then we'll do the individual riser block connections. I went ahead and set up the piece of roadbed, and I'll show you in a minute. I checked the center lines, made sure they were accurate. So what I want to do now is put in a couple of holes for these screws that I'm going to use to hold everything in place. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, that's got those started. Okay, now that I've got those there and I know where the center line is going to be, I want to glue this and set it in place permanently. Okay, so then let's apply a coating of our Tight Bond glue to the splice plate that I put in several weeks ago. And we'll put this back in place and clamp it down good and tight. Okay, that's there. And now I'm going to go back over here and check and make sure everything's lined up perfectly. And I'm going to take a clamp and set it up out here, just to make sure nothing moves on me. And now we'll go ahead and insert the wood screws that I use. I'm using 1-inch flat heads with Phillips. Okay, so that's going to hold those while they're setting up. And between the glue and the screws, these things are not going to go anywhere. Okay, so now that we've got the screws holding the splice plate together, I want to go ahead and add the screws that are going to go down into my riser and hold the roadbed down firmly. I'm going to go back to my number 6 1 5/8 inch indoor screws and get those set in good and tight. Okay, and I'll get that sanded smooth before I start adding my track. Okay, so we'll give it one more check and make sure, yes, we've held the center line perfectly, no problems there. So I'm going to go ahead and pre-drill the holes for the screws that are going to hold the roadbed in place. So let's see, let's start over here. That's pretty well centered on this corner. Okay, and we'll go out here and catch this one. think. And add our screws. I'm sure some of you have noticed that I haven't put any glue on the tops of the blocks. It'd be kind of difficult to get glue down underneath here. I probably could with an applicator of some kind, but with these screws, I don't think it's going to be necessary. Plus, you'll have the subsequent weight of additional levels of roadbed holding it down. Well, after just a few minutes of work, I've got the splice plate glued and screwed together, and the roadbed section here stabilized to the riser. And I've added 3 more pairs of risers here to get the second level started on its trip all the way around. Well, that's it for today's video. Unfortunately, there just wasn't enough time in this video to cover all of the various comments that I got in the previous one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a special video, a bonus video that'll come out the first of next week. And what I'm going to cover in that video are the various types of flex track that I have here and have used on the layout, and give you some tips on working with those, because there are a little bit of differences amongst them. And we'll also be taking a look at how you can go about fixing those little bumps and other imperfections in the rail joiners that you might find when you're building your first Helix in these big curves, or just for general use on your model railroad where you've been joining sections of track by soldering the rail joiners together. So we'll be looking at that and anything else, minor things that I will toss in along with that. So have a great weekend, and we'll see you here next week with another video from the DCC Guy. Bye now.